Okay, so chapter 3, we'll talk about culture and the individual. So in chapter 2, we learned that culture is shared and learned behavior. And because it's shared, it doesn't include individual variation. And so in chapter 3, we kind of look at individuals and how individual personality interacts with culture, and how culture influences personalities and that sort of thing. So here are some of the things we'll talk about. The bullet points here you can see up on the screen. So the universality of psychological development. So when we talk about universals in cultural anthropology, we kind of talk about those things that all humans do, generally speaking. So some examples might be marriage. We'll cover marriage later, and that is a cultural universal. It's something that we find in nearly all cultures. So psychologists or psychological anthropologists, remember that's one of the specializations we talked about in chapter 1, might be interested in how culture influences individuals, their personalities, and then how, or vice versa, how do individuals affect culture in terms of individual behaviors and personalities and that sort of thing. In what respect is psychological development the same the world over? So that's what we're talking about when we think about the universality of psychological development. It wasn't until the 1970s that psychology as a discipline started to realize that its focus was on Western thinking, Western psychology. So by Western I mean big countries like the United States and Europe, where all the psychologists were coming from. They were studying their own people in terms of psychology and kind of had neglected most of the other smaller non-commercial societies that exist, these kind of non-Western mostly. How is it that psychological development happens across all cultures and all humans? So that's, again, why anthropology is important, because it brings in all humans, all times, all places. What is the psychological development that happens to every human? In what respect is it different in this culture than it is in this culture? And, kind of the emotional and cognitive development that goes along with it. So you probably heard of the theory of human cognitive development, and again, psychologists tended to focus on Western cultures, and so is this a universal thing that's found, or is it just kind of a Western thing that from 0 to 2 years is kind of this sensory motor stage. 2 to 6 is the pre-operational stage, 7 to 12 concrete optional, 12 to adult formal operational, where you reason extractly and think hypothetically, that sort of thing. And so that's one theory of human cognitive development, but does it apply to all cultures? So one thing, the anthropology of childhood. So again, childhood is when we learn culture, what is expected of us, but it's also where our personalities and our psychological aspects come to be developed. So looking cross-culturally and explaining variation in childhood and beyond, so some things that cultural anthropologists might think influences this would be the parents' belief system. So that's kind of, you would think is common sense. So your parents are going to have an influence on your psychological development as a child, or adaptational explanations. So maybe based on your own particular home environment or just the environment in general, might bring about some of the variation in childhood development psychology. And then there's kind of, again, the nature versus nurture. There may be some physiological genetic explanation for personality as well. And so with culture, again, it's learned, and it can be, I mentioned in chapter 2 that language is a powerful transmitter of culture, but just kind of mimicking or imitating is as well. And so through childhood development, you see the young boy imitating his father here with the hammer and nail, or the young girl on this side doing her doll's hair as her mom's doing her hair. So it's kind of these picking up observation and imitation is a way of learning for children, of course. Looking at the parental side of it then, our culture is going to dictate in a way how we act as parents, how we raise our children. So some cultures are different. So if we look at cross-cultural variation, of course there's individual variation again, but generally speaking, in our culture, if a baby cries or gets hurt, there's a certain responsiveness that is expected from parents. Now, in another culture, it may be that a different type of response is expected. Maybe it's no response at all, So there's that would be one cross-cultural variation to look at. Parent-child play. In some cultures, parents play with the children on a regular occasion. In other cultures, they don't play with the children at all. There's a complete separation between adult play and child play. Parental acceptance and rejection of children. Again, there's cross-cultural variation there as to how accepting parents are or rejecting certain types of behavior, that sort of thing. Compliance or assertiveness. What are the parental expectations? Are they following? Are the parents being assertive in making sure that the children are being compliant with their expectations and the cultural expectations? There's cross-cultural variations in attitudes toward aggression. So in some cultures, aggression amongst children is put down right away, stopped, tried to be dealt with in a way that doesn't bring about more aggression, or in some cultures, aggression is encouraged. Task assignments. Some cultures, their kids may not have any chores. In other cultures, children may even be working to help the family and that sort of thing. And just the general settings. There's cross-cultural variation in where the children hang out during certain times of the day and that sort of thing. So when we think, with those of you with a psychological background or interested in psychology, you've kind of heard of this concept of the self, or it's kind of breaking down psychology into this concept of the self. So many anthropologists have concluded that the concept of the self in many non-Western societies is quite different from the Western conception. And so this is pretty interesting to me, I think, just based on the culture that you're in, it affects your own internal thinking, your own psychological abilities or aspects. So your concept of a self, for an example might be with the environment. So, my particular concept of myself is that I'm kind of, most of the time anyway, think that I'm kind of separate from the environment. But in some cultures, they lump them, they see the environment as an extension of the self, that sort of thing. So we can look at perceptual styles. So how do different cultures, as individuals within the cultures, perceive certain things? And we're going to use the environment example again. So might the environment influence the way people in different societies think and perceive? And two concepts here are field independence and field dependence. So in the field independence aspect, that's a culture that kind of emphasizes kind of looking at things, parts within a system. So it's being able to isolate this particular part. This is where the problem is. This is what we need to focus on to improve this overall situation. Whereas field dependence are parts are not perceived separately, but as a whole. So the whole situation is focused on rather than just one individual part. And so culture will influence whether a person in that culture tends to be field dependent or field independent. Now we mentioned aggression in childhood development. that's going to carry over into adulthood. So we see psychological variation, cross-cultural variation in terms of expressing aggression. So again, it's kind of this continuum to no aggression is allowed to aggression is very common. So societies vary markedly in the degree into which adults express anger and act aggressively towards one another. So, for example, we'll get into food getting strategies later, but pastoralists are people that bring around their nomadic groups of people that take herds of animals across the landscape to as their way of getting food. And Robert Egerton found that pastoralists were more willing than farmers to express aggression openly. So here they found a correlation between food getting strategy and aggressiveness. So one specialization within cultural anthropology is psychological anthropology, and this is sometimes called the culture and personality kind of school of thought or paradigm. Psychological anthropologists are interested in the possible causes of psychological differences between societies, as well as the possible consequences of psychological variation. So basically, how does culture influence personality, or personalities influence culture, that sort of thing. So some of your big-time cultural anthropologists who are interested in this sort of thing would be Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. They would both be considered psychological anthropologists, kind of looking at possible causes of psychological differences. So Adam Gardner suggested that cultural patterns influence personality development, and the resulting personality characteristics influence the culture. So it's almost as if sometimes you could assign personality traits to a culture. So just as kind of your own fun exercise, you might take a second and think about, what are some personality traits of my particular culture, and do I also have those personality traits, and how does that differ from say the Chinese culture or something like that. And so when we look at these different cultural patterns, we might talk about primary institutions and secondary institutions. And kind of this personality integration of culture, which refers to the possibility that an understanding of personality might help us explain connections between these primary and secondary institutions. So primary institutions are those institutions that mold personalities. So they might be things like religion or something like that. Secondary institutions are those things that kind of project the personality. So it might be music or folklore, that sort of thing. And so Margaret Mead, I just mentioned a little while ago, she has a quote that I'm going to probably butcher here and poorly paraphrase, but that the individual is, a group of individuals can bring about positive change within a culture, or can bring about, the ones that can make the change. And so individuals can act as agents of cultural change. And so you might think of, this is not necessarily brought about a good change, but you might think of someone like Hitler. He was definitely an individual acting as an agent of cultural change within 1940s Germany. So ethnographers, if you remember from chapter 1 there, the people that go out and live with a group of people and write their account, are focusing more explicitly now on how individual agency may bring about change. So again, ethnographers are looking at typical characteristics, but also maybe seeing how particular individuals within the culture are bringing about cultural change. So that is chapter 3, and so if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot an email. Thanks.